you guys for coming today. And today's program is going to be by Dr. Jessica Brennan-Bernowski. She is a distinguished professor of digital humanities and history in the Department of History at Texas A&M University in Commerce. And she does a lot of things with documentary filmmaking and that kind of thing, which is what she's going to focus on today. I also want to thank this month's sponsor, who is Stacy Foley. And Jessica has been in the area for, what did you say,
15 years for Commerce, but 20-something years for North Texas.
Yeah, so cool. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, when I was asked to come give this talk, it was specifically in connection to the documentary film that I've been working on recently. I do all sorts of public-facing projects, digital projects, that kind of thing. But with documentaries, you know, you really need to show some film clips in order to be able to talk about what is going on and kind of be able to look at them. And so what I'd like to do today is actually show you a couple of, one's an entire film, but it's a little film. So this year I co-produced, I should say, with Ellen Temple and Nancy Shasari, who are, one's a film producer and director, and the other is a film producer and all-around public history advocate. I don't know, she does all sorts of things, Ellen Temple. But 5 short films that were spin-offs, sort of, from a larger film that we did a few years ago that aired on PBS called Citizens at Last, which the broadcast version came out on PBS in 2020, 2021, and then there's also an extended version. And all of those films, plus the 5 short films, you can go either to citizensatLast.com and get access to all of these. They're free, they're open, you can watch them. Or you can go to jessicabrennan-bernowski.com, which will then take you to, there's a link to the Citizens at Last. But also, my personal website will also take you to the website for the other film that I'm going to talk about today, which is Shaking It Up, The Life and Times of Liz Carpenter. And for those of you at home watching, you won't be able to get to see the clips that I'm going to show today of the Liz Carpenter film because of corporate licensing that I'll talk about in a little bit, that we don't have the ability to do that, but we're going to go ahead and leave the clips in from the others because we can do that. One of the things about film and working in film that I had to learn about, and you have to readjust your mind and your eyes, is telling history stories, or just telling stories in general very visually. This is something where something has to constantly be going on in the forefront in someone's eyes. You don't have to have sound every microsecond. You need sound most of the time, but you absolutely have to have images in there. And the first film I'm going to show, which is the short film on a performer named Eliza Peterson, and I chose this one honestly because most of the time that this is going on, she lives in Texarkana, and it's geographically as close as I can get to Greenville. There were only a couple of images that we had of her, that we knew about of her. And so how do you tell a film, a story about someone where you have 2 pictures, you know? And you have to fill that in, and you have to think about what's going on in the story and what happens. All of the films that I've worked on, and I need to put this out there as kind of a disclaimer, I'm not the only one running the show. I'm not the director. I'm a version of a producer. For the Liz Carpenter film, I was an associate producer. For the 5 short films, I was a producer. My role was very similar most of the time, except sometimes when it came to funding. I was grant funding, very grant funding involved on the Liz Carpenter film, and so was A&M Commerce. In other words, they were an institution that received grants on behalf of the film, is what I mean on that. But that was because I was the lead historian. And so I'm the lead historian on this, and I'm the lead historian on these and the longer PBS suffrage films as well, because this is my area. I'm the expert on most of this. And for these 5 films, which like I said, I'm only going to show one today, but you can go and watch any of them, And then the 2 longer versions, and they're not really versions. These stories are not in that other film. These are completely independent films. But they inform one another, okay? We weren't done. We finished the long film and said, you know, there's a few stories we still like to tell. It turns out that a 5-minute or a 7-minute film is just about as labor heavy as 87-minute film.
Yes.
Because you still have to conceptualize the story, you still have to organize the labor, you still have to have funding, you still have to find the resources and the actual individual sources, and you still have to have the narrator and write the script and all these things. Maybe the amount of time you're spending on some of those things are less, but it was a real surprise when we decided, oh, we're going to do these 5 films, and we're like, oh, that won't take very long, and years later, they were done. And they were accidentally done about the same time as the Liz Carpenter film was, because they go through a lot of finishing. The other thing that I want to say about this is that the teams that I worked with were amazing. I'm not going to get to show the credits today, but both with the LizCarpenterFilm.com website, where you can go and at least see about that film. It's just not been fully released yet to the public and won't happen until 2025. And all of these others, we have archival researchers, we have directors, producers, film editors. And film editors are really central to everything that goes on. They're not just cutting film, they're making a lot of determinations. So you get to see their conceptualization, and then you go, wait a minute, that's not how I would have done that, or I don't feel that's historically accurate, or we need to flip something. You go back. I've probably seen versions of clips of these so many times that I don't even have the time to remember what we actually chose. I watch it and I go, oh, I've never noticed that before, and I'm probably the one who chose something. But it's just because you go over and over and you read the scripts over and over again, and you go, no, I don't like that. No, we need not to say that. No, that's not how that's pronounced. No, that wasn't that year. Over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And so you work almost more editorial work and discussion, or at least I did, on all of these films than you do sometimes with writing a book, it feels like. Probably not, but at least it felt that way. So for further ado, one of the things I want everyone to notice in this particular film, again, one of the other reasons I think it's a good one to choose is that we did only have 2 images of her, and we knew very little about her. The large portion of the narrative about Eliza Peterson and her background, that came from my research. We knew about her, we knew she existed. She'd been written about and mentioned in a few Handbook of Texas Entries articles, but she didn't have one on her own until my research became publicly available, and I shepherded, I guess you could say, the biographical article that's on her in the handbook. Because another one of the projects that I run is that I'm the project director of the Handbook of Texas Women, which is all the women's history in the Handbook of Texas. And so, one of the many things. But what you also see is how much we have to rely on images that don't have her in it. But it's all still image. You'll notice that. And then when we get to the Liz Carpenter pieces, for those of you who won't be able to see the clips, I'm still going to describe a few things. You're going to see a lot more interview-based. You're going to see a lot of video. And so, because we had that available. Also, Liz Carpenter is unbelievably famous during her lifetime. She's in spaces, she's in the Johnson administration. She's the head of ERA America a few decades later. She's a journalist in Washington, D.C. She's very, 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 very much out in the spotlight. So we have ABC and NBC and CBS clips of her for decades. BBC, I mean, she's on the Tonight Show. All of these things are happening. And so you go from, at least I did, I'm the one that's in common of the two, of all of these projects. There isn't anybody else. But you go from, all right, we have these 2 pictures of someone, to, my God, there's all this video where Liz is talking. And so Liz gets to tell her story for some of that through the Liz Carpenter film. And that's a very different experience with storytelling and kind of visual, but also conceptualizing where it can go and why certain things happen. And so I'm going to show you, it's about a 6-minute clip on Eliza Peterson, and we can kind of get to see this type of documentary, and then I'll show you a couple of the clips from the other. And I mean, you'll see the stark difference, but also we can then talk afterwards about some of the experiences of historians on these films.
Sleep.
Also, this is a 19th century to early 20th century largely story. That also tells us a lot about what's just available technologically at those times.
And suffragist Eliza Eubanks Peterson was born in 1874 in Wescombe, Texas, near the Louisiana state line, the daughter of a farmer, Rufus Eubanks, and his wife Julia. Peterson's parents and her maternal grandparents were born enslaved. On her mother's side, Peterson was part of a strong and close-knit family. Her maternal grandfather was one of the first ordained African-American ministers in an East Texas church. Though little is known about Peterson's first marriage or her father's history, it seems significant that Peterson and her mother left rural life and moved to the growing black middle-class community in Texarkana. Often, Peterson explained in her temperance speeches that she came to the cause from her own experience of her father's alcoholism. She knew how liquor could destroy a family. Alcohol addiction threatened the survival of many families. By the 1880s, consumption of liquor was an epidemic. Men of every creed and race were steady customers at saloons, and women of every race and creed had no legal defense against them. Men had power over women and rights to their property. If men drank their wages, they left their wives with no way to provide for their children. Without legal protection, women had no defense against physical or sexual violence. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, WCTU, was established, and thousands of women joined from Protestant churches, missionary groups, and mutual aid societies all over the United States to fight for the prohibition of alcohol. They spoke out against politicians bribed by the liquor industry, who stayed silent while brothels, child prostitution, and saloons proliferated. Many women supported both temperance and women's suffrage, believing that real protection lay in the right to vote. Black women in the South advocated for temperance as early as the Reconstruction era. Lucy Thurman of Jackson, Michigan, was the only black founding member of the WCTU, and she pressed the white leadership for the inclusion of black women. Lucy Thurman wrote, "I had always favored the organization of unions among the colored women, for it will be to them just what it has been to our white sisters, the greatest training school for the development of women." In 1883, the WCTU established the National Department of Colored Work, and 10 years later, Thurman became its first national superintendent. Thurman went to Texas in 1897 to organize, and in Texarkana met Eliza Eubanks Peterson, then 23 years old. The meeting changed Peterson's life. The following year, Peterson was elected Texas State President of the segregated division of the WCTU. An effective organizer, Peterson traveled throughout Texas and established local and youth WCTU groups in an effort to decrease alcohol consumption. When Thurman retired in 1909, the National WCTU Convention elected Eliza Peterson National Superintendent of the Black Division. Peterson was now among a growing number of black women making an impact on American politics. She traveled widely and spoke eloquently for temperance and suffrage. Most often her audience was composed of small groups of black women in homes and churches. But Peterson also addressed larger interracial crowds of women and sometimes men.
A colored woman of national prominence, slender little woman, but there is dynamic power in her heart.
Mrs. Peterson spoke in a very thrilling and enthusiastic manner, charming her hearers and impressing many relative to both temperance and suffrage as they hadn't been before.
On her travels, Peterson arrived in Auburn, New York, to seek advice from legendary Harriet Tubman, Moses of the Underground Railroad. She found that Tubman was dying Tubman invited Peterson to join the friends, family, and minister gathered around her deathbed in songs and prayers in a final service directed by Tubman herself. Eliza Peterson was instrumental in the national campaign to pass a constitutional amendment prohibiting the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcohol. In January 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified and stayed a federal law until 1933. The U.S. Census of 1940 lists Peterson as a widow living in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. She died on May 31st, 1966, at age 91. On her death certificate, her occupation is given as missionary worker. Eliza Peterson's leadership in the fight for prohibition and suffrage empowered women of her time, in Texas and beyond its borders, to take an active role in changing their world.
So you get this 5-minute clip, right? And it's biographical. You know who the center of the story is. You see what's going on. You get a little bit of background. And one of the other things that you learn very quickly about film is you don't get to say everything you want to. So there's this, we don't know anything about her father. We don't know anything about her father's family. We know nothing about her first husband. We don't even know his name. I have looked and looked. I think I haven't. But it would be unusual because he's white. And so I'm not sure that's him, but it really has to be. But there's no document that says that it's him, except he's in that space and with the name that needs to be the name at the time. And also things like it, you know, we take her from Wascom, Texas, between Louisiana and Texas, to Texarkana. Actually, she's in Dallas for a while and goes to school there, and that's where we think she meets her first husband. And some of that actually I learned after we did this film because I'm finishing up changes on a book this is in. And we know more about her father before she's born than we do after she's born. So it's not her story. And so you have to remember what is the story about? And this is also very much about what we do with women's history. What is the story about? Who is the story about? Because a lot of the time with women's history or other types of what you say disfranchised history, racial history, ethnic history, labor history, a lot of times the records are about the people who are in power, and you have these little tastes and these little hints about the people you're wanting to tell a story about, and you could easily just tell the story about the ones who are in the center of the record, but all of a sudden, the story's not about who you're telling the story about anymore. And so you can back up and go, okay, yeah, we have more. For example, Eliza Peterson's father is the son of his enslaver. We don't know who his mother is, but that's because his father dies in a cholera epidemic that kills over 100 enslaved laborers on his Louisiana plantation. It's so bad that the census taker shows up and goes, I've never seen a note like this ever, and I've been through more records, census records. I'm one of those people that during COVID just would go through the primary sources I was looking for people in and just sit there. My husband's like, are you going to put the book of, Catholic marriages in San Antonio from the last 3 centuries away? And I'm like, 3 more pages. And it's just basically the marital certificates over and over and over again. But that's what we have to do. We're searching, right? But I've never seen a census record like this. And the census taker saying, this is my best guess of how many people are here, because the overseer saw people dying of cholera and takes off, and this is a new overseer. We don't. The plantation owner's dead. About 100 people have died, it's chaos. But the reason we know that's his father is because he frees him in his will, and he says, "This is my son," and he frees him, and so we know who it is and what's going on. And we know a little bit about him growing up because we know who he goes to live with, which is a white family. We would say like a foster family in 20th and 21st century. They're being paid to take care of this child, okay, this multiracial child. And the foster quote-unquote father, for lack of a better phrase, is a liquor dealer. And that's as close as we get to the story. And that's the end. That's all we know. And we know who he marries, and we know all sorts of things about, I know, and the book will tell. But all sorts of things about her mother's family, because these generations have been passed on, but also because her mother stays central to her life. We know who her mother is, but this family is very much about getting their story out there in different public history spaces over time. And so, you know, we get to know that her grandfather on mother's side was a minister during slavery. And of course, he's ordained after emancipation. But, you know, you get to see this, and so there's this kind of thing, but that's not her story. Nothing I just said is her story, right? And so you have to go, all right, what do we know about her? And what do we need to know about them in the 5 minutes we're going to tell you that gets you that story along, right? And how much do you spend telling tidbits versus how much do you spend moving the storyline along? Because you can't do either only. You have to stop every once in a while and tell a little bit, right? Then you need to move on. And then so it's that kind of thing. And so the next series of film clips I'm going to show you is very different in its approach. Partially, again, like I said earlier, because of the technology we had access to, but also the only two people that were interviewed for this film that didn't know the subject of the film in her lifetime. And I was in a room with her multiple times, but I'm like this little grad student. Probably the only shy time I ever had in my life, and I wish I hadn't. But you know, there's Liz Carpenter's in the room, you know, my gosh. And so I didn't go up and introduce myself, but it came back around later, and I got to know her daughter very well. But myself and then Julia Zweig are the two historians that are in this film that were interviewed. We may or may not see a clip with Julia in it, but there is. I'm stuck in on one of them. But everybody else knew her. But not only that, she spends the vast majority of her adulthood in front of a camera of some sort. So the amount of images, the amount of photos is just crazy. And so at that point you start asking, you know, what do you need? So this particular film did its global debut in March at South by Southwest in Austin. And just to give you a general idea, this is one of the major film festivals in the United States, in North America actually. About 4% of films that are pitched are chosen every year to be able to do this. We wanted to be South by Southwest. It's the perfect place. Liz was Austin through and through. There's a following still in Austin, people who knew about her, and that kind of thing. And so it was a great place, but we didn't know if we were going to get accepted. And we did. And you know, people were coming that knew her, remembered her, and that kind of thing. It's a very different experience to be in that than people going, God, I didn't know anything about this woman. As opposed to people in the audience saying, why didn't you have so-and-so in this film? You know, and what was going on there? And you just kind of like, because you have so much time. And the story's about Liz, not so-and-so. You know, that kind of thing. Although the Johnson, LBJ and Lady Bird Johnson, she worked for the LBJ administration, first as under his vice presidential administration, and then under his presidential. She was the chief of staff and also the press secretary for Lady Bird as first lady. And her and Lady Bird Johnson were really close. So, of course, the Johnsons are in this film like you wouldn't believe. And actually, one of the pieces I'm going to show, it's very much about them. But it's because their stories are so intertwined. The issue was we knew the major pieces we needed to get in there. And then here I am as the historian, because her daughter's one of the producers and directors, saying, okay, we need to back it up. We need context here. We're going to back it up. I'm going to give a list. The reason I'm showing this clip is for a couple of reasons. I think you'll kind of see why geographically in a minute. But the second clip, I'm going to do the trailer first. But also towards the end of this clip, it gets to be a little more historical kind of voice and history, but also I give a list of women's names, okay? And you'll see what happens. Man, we went back and forth on who I was going to say. And back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth on which women I was going to mention. And I was telling them why I wanted to do certain people. And they're like, no, let's squeeze so-and-so in there. And I'll be honest, at the end, I said who I wanted to say. And you know, but you have to have those conversations. And it's one of the things when you do public history, but any sort of group projects for everybody out there, that you have to make sure you're compromising, but you also have to know where your boundaries are. Like, this is what I think needs to happen, this is why. And since this was coming out of my mouth, since I'm the historian, but I'm not her biographer. I'm the historian of the era and the women's groups that she was part of. And so that's why I was going, all right, contextual. We need to back this up. And so, you know, it was, they agreed with that. And once they knew who a couple of folks were that I was adding, they were like, oh yeah, absolutely. All right, so here's the trailer, which is actually also the first 2 minutes of the film. And we did that on purpose, to be honest, because it's a great intro to who she is very quickly in 2 minutes. We have to deal with the fact that lots of people know who she is, but the vast majority of the audiences outside of Texas, and probably outside of Austin, have not heard of her yet. And so this is like someone who was enormously famous for a while, but now is going to be, you know, is now being brought back to the public mind. And so it's a good opening, but also because trailers are very, very expensive to produce. And so you have to go, all right, how are we going to do this and how are we going to do that? And so we went, you know, and I'm going, oh, okay. As soon as I knew per second what we were probably going to be doing as the negotiations went on with the different corporate entities, I'm doing math in my head and thinking, whoa. But also, you have to license music and you have to license, you know, particular graphics and all of these kinds of things. And so documentary film, depending on what level you're doing it, I mean, you still always have to, with every type of publishing, keep an eye out on that. So here, I'm going to show you one of the most, this is about a 10-minute clip, but I'm going to describe it, don't turn any film off yet. Actually, I'll describe it after, so that people who are here, that's about as close as I can get. All right. First it talks about and shows the JFK assassination and this transition from LBJ becoming vice president to being president, right? And you go, okay, that's not Liz's story, but it very much is, because she's so central to the way this is being framed, but also what's going on in the White House, that, and Dan Rather is interviewed as part of this piece here, and he says, you know, she's holding the Johnsons together, which means she's helping to hold the nation together. That's a really big statement in that moment. And part of the film that we show is the Magruder film, right? The film of JFK being assassinated. There's very few film clips in the 20th century that are more famous, you know? And so you look at this and you go, okay, this woman's living in that moment, not just in that moment, in that room. And with Liz Carpenter, it was that way over and over and over and over and over and over again. So there was a discussion at one point about whether or not, I don't know if this is for public consumption, but here we go, whether or not Christy could be on film, her daughter. And she's interviewed throughout, she narrates some of the film as well, because Christy's also a director and producer, and this is a big no-no in film production to put a director on screen, okay? Unless it's a biopic about them. And my stance as historian was, oh, she absolutely has to be in this film. She's really one of the few people who's there for a large portion of it, but in very private spaces. So to give you an example, there were a few different anecdotes Christy gives on film. We picked one. That's one of the things, as Roy said earlier, you don't get to put everything in by far. I don't know if I should do the one we picked or the one we didn't pick. I think I'll do the one we picked. Because there may be a reason why they didn't put the other one in. No, I'm going to do the one we didn't pick. So they're very similar in nature, and they're talking about Liz being a very, very busy mother. Okay? Where are you going to get that? You know, we've got to be reminded that while she's doing all this stuff in the White House, she's also a mom and a wife, and her husband's running the news bureau. Her and Les Carpenter, her husband, had founded together in Washington, D.C. And so she's telling the story, and she says, so they want to get a gift for Les Carpenter, Christy's husband, and he's a gardener. And so she's going to go and she's going to get a statue of St. Francis to put in the garden, okay? Because that's very, Francis is the saint for, animals and care and very often connected to nature in the narrative. So she goes and she brings home the statue and she puts it down, and Christy and her brother say, "Mommy, that's not St. Francis, that's Jesus!" And she would have been so quick to go and do and pick and go and just like hurry and get this done, she hadn't realized it. And she goes, oh well. Liz says, oh well, you just can't return Jesus. So Jesus gets put in their garden. You know, and it's just like this moment of, you really get to see one, Liz was funny pretty much all the time. My favorite things about her is that she was so funny. I read her and Irma Bombeck toured the United States on behalf of the ERA. They were co-heads of ERA America. And I grew up reading Irma Bombeck way earlier than it would have been because she's funny. I was in high school reading it's a book called A Marriage Made in Heaven or Too Tired for an Affair. And it's not indiscreet. It's just funny about marriage. And my typing teacher was like, why are you reading this at 17? I was like, because she's funny. You know, and so I love that. And Liz was very much like that. And they offset each other very, very well. But also, you want that humor to come across, but you don't want the whole movie to be slapstick, right? And so you have this balance. And I was teasing Christy about which, so my team developed the website for the film. Okay, it's not what I did, but I volunteered to do that, partially because it was a good experience for the folks who are working for me or were and are working for me, but also because it takes pressure off of the film production side. This is something I do very regularly. We can do this, it's great. And I was teasing Christy about it, and I was going, you know, we need to have a quote. And I was teasing her over and over again about the different quotes we should use. And I said, you know, I was thinking about something like, you know, if it's windy, y'all close your mouths. She goes, oh my God, Jessica, don't put that out. The story behind that is, Liz is on her deathbed. Like, she's going to die very, very, very soon. She's going to be cremated. And she's going to go get scattered on Slater Hill, where Slater College was, okay? College Hill, I'm sorry, it's Slater. And she speaks up and she says, now don't forget, if it's windy that day, y'all close your mouths. So, I'm thinking, and I know Christy will lose it, because nobody's going to put that on the website, okay? But she's like 5 seconds from passing away, and she's still funny, right? And I'm going, that's what I want to be when I grow up, right? That's where I want to be, that sharp and that funny, or I'm not that funny. I would like to be that funny, but you know, just in that moment. But she goes, oh, she had all these. I was like, we'll pick the inspirational quotes. Don't worry, you know. But that was the kind of person she was, and part of how she handled it. Towards the end of the film, and I'm not going to give it all away, because I hope you all do see it, and come to see it. A&M Commerce will be hosting something in the fall in Dallas. Once it's supposed to air on PBS in 2025, most of the films that I do eventually, I should say I'm involved with, I feel like I just get to be there. I'm not going to lie. I'll say this on camera and everywhere else. I'm just like, man, I need to be there. You know, I have to remember every day that I'm the expert too, so I need to lean in with boundaries and things, but I'm just like, that's so cool. Evan Andrews, Evan Smith, sorry, is the founder of the Texas Tribune, okay, but for a long time he was also an American statesman. He was a journalist, and he says towards the end of the film, he says something along the lines of, you know, Liz was never out to hurt anybody in politics. She was always, you know, she was funny and she used humor, but she wasn't out to hurt anybody. It was about, you know, forwarding the agenda. Gloria Steinem says on film at one point, we interviewed her about Liz, or about the National Women's Political Caucus that Liz and her and a number of other people were co-founders of, that it was about being, you know, bipartisan or non-partisan, however you want to put that. But women from all political parties and all directions, everything else, just, and Gloria Steinem says, you know, that may sound impossible to people who are watching this today. And it's this really interesting moment where you kind of pause and you go, all right, what can you get out of this film? And it is mildly idealistic. I mean, it's a biography. They usually are, unless it's the opposite, right? But also, there's this discussion of the behind the scenes and what people in politics are actually wanting to achieve. And I think it's a really good different look. One of the other things this film does very well that is now kind of coming out is how feminist the Johnson administration was. That floors people. You know, they don't think about that. But Johnson's appointing women in administrative roles at a high level. Lady Bird Johnson had an enormous advisorial role with LBJ, and we haven't seen that before. This, and then there's another documentary that came out last year that's now more widely available that I suggest everyone watch. It's called The Lady Bird Diaries, and Liz Carpenter's enormously in that. And it also uses a lot of, it's all the audio is historic audio. So if the filmmakers want to talk to you, they talk to you in print, and that's it. It's just really interesting immersion. Liz Carpenter died in 2010. Every single video, every single audio of her was all done before this film was ever conceived. But we have it because of where she was and the central nature of what she was doing for as long as she was doing. And so you'll notice she talks a lot in this film, a lot. She probably talks more than anybody else. So it's immersive in a different kind of way. So that's kind of what I've been working on. You know, the day-to-day work can be so minute, down to which women was I going to list in this list of 5 or 6 women, or what scene do we want to do, and I don't get a lot of say, and sometimes I get a lot of say. You just don't know. Because in those moments you go, okay, I'm going to compromise on this. The one thing as a historical advisor I never compromised on, and no one ever asked me to when it got down to it. When you make your argument and you explain why, with historical accuracy to the best of our ability. There's nothing perfect, ever. But historical accuracy to the best of our ability. And so, you know, that's the thing, whatever we produce. And that's why you want historians to observe on these things, because perspective and then what, you know, context and what the documents and everything else tell us is kind of going on in the background, and then bringing other stuff in that helps with that. And also, you know, as a historian, it's really fun. So I highly suggest becoming a historian. But to open this up, does anybody have any questions? And thank you so much.
Okay, I go back to the first lady you talked about.
The first film?
Yeah.
Eliza Peterson.
Yeah, Peterson. And you were talking about her husband being white.
What we're not sure. It might have been. Mm-hmm.
Okay, because just thinking about that time period before.
It wouldn't have been legal.
Yes.
That's why I'm not sure it's him.
Okay.
We don't have a marriage certificate. We don't have anything that says that's him. What you have to do is you go, okay, things like census records and directories and voting records, or especially with men before suffrage, of course, before women getting the right vote. And you honestly, the first thing you do is start looking for the last name. Mm-hmm. And when there's nobody else in the area with that last name, you start getting very suspicious. Mm-hmm. But also that person's in all the places he needs to be. He's in Dallas, and then he's in Texarkana. And he may have been a white doctor from Europe. But still, his family does live here, and it may not be him. So I will say that today, and I will say that in public, but I probably won't print it.
Okay, so if did she have any children?
No.
No, she didn't. Okay, so there was
there were never children. We don't know if she's divorced. We don't know if she's widowed. A lot of divorced women during that period will say they're widowed. A lot of divorced men will say they're widowers. Divorce is not, you know, done at that. I mean, it is. It was done all the time, but we don't think of it as because it wasn't socially acceptable. And so we just know that Peterson is not her maiden name, and she will remarry again. I don't remember, 1919, 1920, to a man named Christopher Johnson, who's the wealthiest African-American man in Alabama, or one of the wealthiest. They meet in church and missionary work. Booker T. Washington writes about him. So very well connected. I mean, she's the national head of the African-American section of the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
You were saying that her father was half white too?
He was.
So that means she was part white?
She is, and she's very light-skinned. And do I think she was passing? No. But, or at least all of the time. For white, but she is very light-skinned, and you know that creates complication. Where does she get married? I mean, her father just disappears. I'm not joking with you all. Cannot find him. There's a couple people who might be him. He may have died. They may have moved away because he had drinking problems. He may have had health issues. He may have gone off. We don't know. We don't know what happens to him in her lifetime. We have them on the 1880 census, and it says they're farting. And we know it says that she's born in Texas, but they're living in Louisiana. For a long time, however, it's like, okay, they move. Wascom is literally on the state line. They're probably living in that tiny little area. And Wascom has the church that her mother's father is the minister for. Okay? So they're probably living right there. Right over the Louisiana line is the plantations. Both plantations that her enslaved families were enslaved on. So they're right there. Just because it was born in Texas, 1880 census, and a few years later the 1880 census puts them in Louisiana and he's farming, they're probably still within about a mile or two of each other. But that's all we have. And so we know who he is, we know it's her father, her death certificate and all this, and the family is written a little bit. But, you know, it's this weird thing of, we know so much more about her, which is so unusual. She did have a stepchild with her second husband, who might have been his niece or nephew. Nephew. It's a boy, it has to be a nephew, sorry about that. And then they adopt him, and he's listed as the son or the adopted son on records later, but it's the only children. And so again, you have to kind of put this story together. What do you do?
Did she perhaps have siblings who might have had descendants that may or may not know what happened to the father?
So there are descendants in East Texas, and I have found a few, and I will be contacting them. But that's one of those things where you don't realize that until much later,
True.
right? And so this film's out, it's done. And so, but you'll notice we worded things very carefully. Not much is said about her father. Not much is said about, because one, we couldn't tell those other pieces of the story and lose it, and we don't know what happens in her lifetime. And sometimes descendants are helpful, and sometimes they're not. I'm not going to say there aren't, I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes you just don't know.
A different suffragist that I worked on, Mariana Folsom. I don't do biographies, and I tell people I don't do that, and everybody laughs at me because I do a lot of biographical things, but history is miniature biographies in context very often, right? So Mariana Folsom is someone that I've done a lot of work on. The larger suffrage film that I mentioned earlier, she's a piece of that too. But I'm the biographer in her, I guess is a short version. Article kinds of things and in larger suffrage book. But I got to meet her, I think 3 times great-granddaughter. I think that's right. And Miss Tilly was lovely. Actually, I found her because she would put out these evangelical Christian newsletters, and her granddaughter had digitized and put some online. And I was like, cool. So I get in touch, and I email, and her granddaughter helped email me back, and she says, "Dear, why are you in touch with me? Are you related to us?" You know, kind of thing. I was like, no. And I explained what's going on. She knew nothing about her 3 times great-grandmother. The thing I thought was so fascinating, though, was that Mariana Folsom was the 5th ordained woman in the nation. 5th ordained woman minister. And here, multiple generations later, and her granddaughter is doing this, I don't know how to put it. It's not a church bulletin. It's a newsletter she put out, like a letter. And, but just talking about God and her life and the relationship with faith and that kind of thing. And she did it fairly regularly during her life, for a long time though. And I was so interesting. And I went and met with her, and I was telling her things. And so you never really know, and I've done this many times, you never really know. You're entering into this relationship of, that person has more biological connection, but you've spent a chunk of your life researching this human, and you have to turn that off and go, how can I be of service to this person, and maybe in that conversation get the info. And so in this particular case, I do plan to try to contact the family and see if they'll speak with me, and they may not, and that's okay too.
It's kind of hit or miss what
yeah.
you know about your ancestors and what you don't.
I know. Part of the reason I know about the church history is because they have digitized a few pieces of that church history. That church's history by that family, and that's how I found them. The internet's great for this kind of thing. But yeah, so, and I've had contact with all sorts of descendants, so just very often, more often than not, I'm contacting and telling them about their ancestor and saying, may I use the image you put up on Ancestry? I'll pay or whatever, and they're like, sure, and they're like, tell me more, and I'll send them an article that I've written on them or whatever, and all of a sudden this person's like, oh, I gave this talk to the club I'm a member of, and it's so interesting to watch that happen. I haven't ever had that happen, where a historian has got in touch with me and with my family. I had talked to people about my family's history, and they wanted to know certain things, but they were friends of mine working on certain types of things, and so it must be very weird to just get this phone call that says, hi, so, and luckily I can say, I'm legitimate, I really do exist, you could just Google me, and I always use my university email address. That's a really good thing to do because, I mean, you know, hey, please send me $47.5 and a gift card, you know, kind of thing. I could be fake. I want to know your family history. But, you know, you just try to walk through it.
Yeah, it must be fascinating.
Thank you. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank
It's
you.
been lovely.
Thank you for coming. Let's see, and next month we have the Sunshine Animal Sanctuary that will be speaking. So, something a little bit different.